When someone who has made it something of a life choice to purchase the vehicles which tend to terrify most potential owners, including multiple Maseratis, a Bentley Flying Spur, and no less than a V10 engine Volkswagen Touareg, all of which are known for being cars which are notoriously bad to live with and work on, and yet I have, for the most part, very positive experiences with them, tells you not to buy something, that should say an awful lot. And this video is really going to be disliked by Rolls-Royce aficionados because I'm going to go ahead and tell you, don't buy a Silver Shadow. But for those who must buy a Silver Shadow, I'm going to give you the best piece of advice you will ever hear. Do not restore one. If you are going to buy one, make sure you have the money to buy a mint, borderline concourse example already, and then you are still going to be spending a colossal amount of money to keep it in that condition. Trust me, just like they say about Bentley, there is quite literally nothing more expensive than a cheap Rolls-Royce. Sure, at least here in the UK, you can find plenty of Silver Shadow 1s and 2s for dirt money. 5 to 10 grand for a running, rough example, 2 or 3 for one which needs work but still might turn over, and of course as high as 30, 40, 50 in concourse example, 20 or 30 should buy you a very nice condition one, with, well, feasibly no current work needed. The problem is, there's only one fundamental difference between a good condition Rolls-Royce and a bad condition one, and that is when on your calendar you need to mark down the first repair, because you're gonna have to do it either way. And just to give you some idea of the kind of experience you're in for, regardless of the condition of the car, the servicing of one of these, if you go to, for example, a Rolls-Royce specialist or even a main Rolls-Royce location, I would imagine, is astronomical. But even if you put that to one side, let's say you can find a mechanic who's willing to do it for you, some specialist even, maybe an ex-Rolls-Royce engineer, whatever the case may be. Let's just say you've got really lucky. That still doesn't change the fact that you're going to come across some of the dumbest, some of the genuinely worst engineering ideas I have ever come across. And not only do I say that as a mechanic by trade, but also as someone who has owned the aforementioned, supposedly horrific vehicles in comparison. And here's the key thing, someone who is in a uniquely specific position when it comes to really knowing the truth about how bad a classic Rolls-Royce is. With no counter-argument whatsoever, America in the 60s, certainly the 50s, and to be honest, from what I've seen here even in the 70s, were far ahead of Rolls-Royce. Why can I say that? Because I own one. I have a Rolls-Royce and I have a Lincoln Continental. My Rolls-Royce is a 73 Mark I Silver Shadow, my American is a 1968 Lincoln Continental, so essentially the Bentley of America. And of course, although I haven't owned a classic Cadillac yet, I have been around them, I've seen what kind of build quality is involved, I've owned a modern Cadillac, which doesn't really compare on this example because it's more of a Chevy underneath, and of course I've had probably the best rival to a Rolls-Royce that I've owned, the classic 1960 Lincoln Premier, which was of course the single biggest, most opulent car in the world when it was sold, and to be honest is the only car that I ever regret getting rid of. In the case of this one though, I picked up my Shadow about 8 months or so ago, around February or March of 2024, and it still hasn't run a single time. So why do I still own it? Why would someone who supposedly has so much negative stuff to say about it still own the car? Why would I be working on it, and why, and here's the real hypocrite's kicker, why would I have put more money by far into this car than any other vehicle I've ever owned or worked on? Bear in mind, it still doesn't drive. I've put around £20,000 into this car already, and that includes, of course, getting the vehicle, getting another donor car, and paying for heavy-duty body-off work, etc, etc, and it still isn't finished. I'm expecting to pay probably around another £5,000, maybe plus £1,000 for all of the wiring to be done as well. So why on earth would someone have a ratty Rolls-Royce, such as mine is, an ex-wedding car with only 50,000 miles on the clock, but literally the complete bottom sill of the body is entirely filler, it has a tow hitch on the back, the boot carpet was soaked through with water, it constantly leaks, it has a scorch marking from acid around the battery, or where the battery used to be in the boot. All of the windows, aside from maybe the rear window, had leaks. When you open the driver's door, you could hear it literally sloshing around in the bottom. So why on earth would I have put that kind of money into it? And why on earth would I be telling you not to do it if I'm doing exactly that? Well, some of you who follow the channel, and certainly those of you who are in the members section of the channel, know exactly why I've put that kind of money in. Because it's not a Rolls-Royce anymore. Because mine is just the body and the chassis and the interior of a Rolls-Royce with absolutely no mechanical connection to one whatsoever. In fact, mine is on top of a Mitsubishi L200 now, which is a far superior vehicle underneath in literally every way. You see, contrary to what many people would like to admit who own a Rolls-Royce and vehemently deny anything bad about them, I am in actual fact more qualified to talk about what these cars are actually like, because I've done more work on my Rolls-Royce than 99% of owners ever will. I've been in every nook and cranny of this car. I've been in places and changed things about the car that most owners have never even seen, let alone worked on, and I've put more money into it than most owners will in their first year of ownership. That's for damn sure. But still, it begs the question, why do I still have it? Well, because when I picked up the car, my plan was to just basically turn it into a rat rod. I wanted to slam it to the ground on coilovers, straight pipe exhaust, patinaed paint, basically annoy all the Rolls-Royce fans and have kind of like a British equivalent of my Lincoln, that kind of ratty hot rod vibe. I very quickly saw that when you change one thing on a Rolls-Royce, you've got to change so many things, because so many systems are dependent on each other or can easily fall out of whack. The kind of stuff which you'd expect on a modern car like a Range Rover or a Bentley, but somehow it's just as bad in 1973. Despite the fact that my Lincoln, which is 5 years older than this, is electronically far simpler. It has its issues, but they're far simpler to track down, despite the fact that it doesn't have any kind of Citroen licensed suspension system which Rolls-Royce is known for. No, my Lincoln just has big old coil springs on the front and big old leaf springs on the back. And it's the most comfortable car you will ever be in. And if you think that's luxurious and comfortable, then check out my even older Lincoln. It's on the channel. I don't own it anymore and I regret getting rid of the car, but it's a 1960, so 13 years older than this Rolls-Royce, a Lincoln Premier. That Lincoln puts this Rolls from 13 years later to shame. Auto-dipping headlights, all kinds of clever stuff which it had even in 1950s era technology. This Rolls in comparison has a couple of interesting ideas, like for example it has disc brakes front and rear, which is quite impressive, twin calipers per front brake disc, which is also very cool. But the problem is, when you actually start to live with one of these, if you want to keep it in that original kind of spec, these are some of the things which you're going to have to come across. For example, the bolt pattern on a Rolls-Royce and a Bentley equivalent like a T1 at the time is unique to these vehicles, which means you cannot fit the wheels from any other vehicle onto it without a very drastic modification or some kind of wheel spacer to change the bolt pattern. Personally, I don't think I'd trust wheel spacers on a car like this because of the weight involved and the sloppy suspension, but that's each to their own if you want to change the rims. Let's say you want to keep it original though. Well, recently I mentioned of course that the boot has a leak. It turns out that the leak was actually a twofold issue, which one compounds the other. This to me is the kind of stuff which I consider unforgivable about these cars. See, on the one hand, you have a boot which was inexplicably leaking right in the centre, not from the edges, no overflow, no splashing, and there's no hole in the boot, there's no corrosion going through it, so how on earth could the centre of the boot have a puddle in it? How could the entire carpet be soaking through? Well, simply put, because of two things. Number one, the rubber around the edge, of course, degrades over time. Doesn't seem like that much of an issue. Until I looked up on Flying Spares, which of course is the easiest way to find Rolls-Royce stuff, new and used here in the UK. How much do you think a new boot rubber would be? One which is still feasibly produced to this day because of the demand. Maybe £50? 80? Perhaps 150? Try 875, because that's how much the boot rubber is for this particular Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. Or you could buy a used one for 100, because that's a great deal, isn't it? I bought a generic one, which does exactly the same job, for 25 quid. But even that doesn't annoy me the most. See, what annoys me the most is the design of the boot itself means that as soon as that rubber degrades, even in the slightest, you will not only have a leaking problem, inside the boot it has a two-layer metal structure. The outside layer, especially now that the winter months are coming and the temperatures have dropped, gets completely covered inside with condensation. The second layer of the metal boot, Rolls-Royce decided to cut large holes in, perhaps to save some weight, probably to save some cost. The condensation of course goes straight through those holes, as well as through the umpteen holes all the way around the edge of the boot, designed to hold in the carpet. All of those holes become a self-contained sprinkler system for your boot carpet every time it rains and every time you get any condensation. Now again, the apologists will probably say, well, that's your fault for having your Rolls-Royce out in the rain, that's your fault for not having a car cover, that's your fault for not having a garage, that's your fault for blah blah blah. The reality is these cars are designed to be driven, and for the price that they charge back in the day, and certainly for the prices that they sometimes still command to this day, you both can and should expect, demand and want more quality than that. That is the exact same issue I had with my Bentley Flying Spur, except that was on a 2005 car and they're still having the same kind of problems. In the case of the Bentley, it's the front window. The scuttle vent in front of the windscreen, of course, has waterways where it's designed to run out the bottom. The problem is any kind of debris that builds up inside there, which of course you can't see, and it's an easy job to just forget to do, especially if you've just bought the car, well, the water fills up, it goes back through the dashboard under the passenger seat, where of course they placed one of the ECUs, which is exactly what happened to mine on an 80,000 mile single owner car with a good history behind it. That's unacceptable. That was a £130,000 car in 2005. That is just not acceptable. All the more so on a supposedly authentic, classic Rolls-Royce experience. And the reason why I find it so unacceptable is because the Yank cars that I own, for all the jokes that we Brits like to make about them, they simply don't do that. Yes, they have their own problems. My Lincoln, for example, has a misfire. That's nothing new for a classic, and there are plenty of modern cars which do as well, and let's be honest, not a particularly difficult job to figure out either, considering that a misfire is fairly obvious in terms of where to diagnose it from. At the same time though, I've had my Lincoln for over 2.5 years, most of which has been out in the rain. It has exposed patinaed paint, which doesn't rust. None of the windows have ever leaked, despite the fact that it doesn't even have a window mechanism inside it, and I literally jam the windows shut with screwdrivers, so the windows aren't even sealed properly, and the boot, despite being the size of a small swimming pool and exposed metal inside and out, never gets a single drop of condensation, and despite the fact that the boot rubber all the way around is very heavily perished, has never leaked once. Regardless of your fandom, regardless of whether you dislike American cars or what, that's unacceptable, and it proves that you can do better because America was doing better. Another anecdote which I heard from a fellow classic owner, in fact he forgot he told me the first time, so he's told me a couple of times, he told me the story of being on a cruise once, speaking to an older lady who was very well off and who loved her luxury cars. He asked her, "Do you drive a Rolls-Royce?" She said, "No. Why would I want one of those pieces of trash for? I've got a Lincoln." That to me says a lot, because it's not just about someone who can quote-unquote only afford a ratty car, or who's trying to look like the 1% on a low budget, or whatever other stupid slogan people like to throw around. That was someone with plenty of money who was buying these cars brand new, and clearly from the way she said it, you could tell she'd owned one in the past, which is why she didn't want to again. The thing which honestly impresses me the most about Rolls-Royce is that they managed to have any kind of reputation at all, given that this is what the cars were like back then. And I've only mentioned 1 or 2 issues. I haven't even yet mentioned how the key snapped off in the lock, which of course they have to recut in the same kind of soft metal again, because it ages at the same rate as the lock, which is also a soft metal, so besides completely changing out the ignition, the locks, all the way around, you just don't really have any other choice other than pouring even more money into changing that. And even for Rolls-Royce fans, there are 2 words which I can say which will immediately send a shiver up your spine if you've ever done any kind of hands-on work with your own Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. Those 2 words are rat trap. Most people won't know what I'm talking about, but any Rolls-Royce fan, and certainly a Rolls-Royce owner, will know exactly what I'm talking about. See, Rolls-Royce thought they should reinvent the wheel. Well, not so much the wheel, more the brake, because obviously the brake system needed reinventing, in 1973 of all times. And their great idea was to have a brake pedal which, instead of going forward, like a normal brake pedal, actually curves backwards underneath the driver's area into something called the rat trap. I'm going to probably show you on screen a diagram of the brake pedal setup from a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. And if it's not the dumbest thing you've ever seen, I'd like to see what is. This car is so badly designed that even beyond all those stupid leaks and condensation problems and ridiculous suspension, etc., etc., that has been the single most awkward, most difficult part of the entire custom build that I've been doing for the past 8 months to get around that issue. Because I was planning to just cut through the floor, take out the pedal box, just like you would in a normal car, and use the Mitsubishi pedals instead. Except I couldn't do that, because when you try and cut the floor out, it's immediately the wheel arch and chassis right behind it. So you just can't do that. So what I've had to do instead is cut through the floor by where the clutch pedal would be in a manual car and reconfigure the entire Mitsubishi pedal upside down, re-weld it sideways to try and form some kind of brake pedal that functions in a safe, practical way. So if it's not already obvious, I would advise you not to buy a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. There are only 2 exceptions to that rule. If you absolutely must have one of these, you really care about keeping that original charm, that concourse condition, then honestly, save up for as long as it takes, save up beyond what it takes because you're going to need it, and buy yourself one which is already immaculate. And when I say immaculate, I mean check that it's immaculate. Look everywhere. Check the provenance. Get someone else who knows more than you to check it for you. Do not look for just a shiny paint finish. The only other exception, and honestly this is the one which I think is actually worth it, is exactly what I've done. Strip everything that Rolls-Royce did out of it and keep it as a nice looking shell with a very nice classic interior and shove it on something which is way, way more practical. It means that I get to keep the look, the charm, the cool factor, but without anything that actually lurks underneath. And you'll notice that I haven't talked about how they sound, how they drive, and how woefully underpowered their engines are, etc, etc, etc. Because none of that matters if a car is horrific to live with. These cars are not worth living with in their original condition, certainly not in cheap, rough condition, and I would recommend that if you want to have something like what I've done, or your own project, maybe a hot rod of some kind, your best bet is buy one that is dirt cheap, doesn't even run, and just use the shell. As long as the shell is relatively rust-free. Unfortunately, those 2 things don't tend to go hand in hand that often, but try to find the cheapest one you can. Even then, you are going to have some problems, such as the weird suspension. The travel on the suspension springs, for example, is like 42 inches or something insane. The springs themselves were the first thing that changed my mind on my project, because I was originally, as I said, planning to slam it. Coilovers, basically. Stiffer ride, better through corners, lower down, proper hot rod kind of look. Problem is, there's only one company from what I could find who will even do that, and it costs you about £2,500 per axle without VAT and without fitting. So you're probably talking more like 6 to 7 grand. What I've done with mine is my best case scenario, because on the one hand, yes, I've poured a lot more money into it than I originally planned, but the difference is what I'm getting for that money is a vehicle which now has none of the problems of a Rolls-Royce, but all of the advantages underneath of the Mitsubishi, which is a far better vehicle. So now I've got a 5-speed auto with a low ratio box, 4-wheel drive, 2.5 litre turbo diesel. I've got an enormous custom fuel tank in the boot, which is around 160 litres, so this thing could do over 1,000 miles to the tank if I need it to, and I still have the cool Rolls-Royce looks, but with off-the-shelf replacement Mitsubishi parts underneath and very, very few custom pieces. So even if I do need to replace stuff, it's not that hard to find. That's the kind of way that I would recommend using a Rolls, but of course I'm well aware that that is not for everyone. Ultimately, if you are going to do something like I've done here, well, it depends how much you're going to spend, but I would recommend having £20,000 to £30,000, and that's pretty much lowest end scenario, because it's big work. You've got to find someone willing to do a lot of the stuff which you won't be able to do yourself on your driveway, such as putting the body on top. I don't have a gantry here, of course, to do that with, and so yeah, if you're going to do it, it won't be cheap, but you will end up with, as I am, a pretty damn cool car in the end. That's basically the only time I would recommend having a Rolls-Royce at all, and part of the reason why I'm doing it is, as I think you could probably tell, sheer spite. I am not allowing a Rolls-Royce to be the worst car I've ever had. I was determined to make something of it, and if you're going to make something of it, just go all out. I would actually leave you with one parting piece of wisdom. If someone sneers at your idea of what you want to do to a Rolls-Royce, if someone turns their nose up at your Rolls-Royce, as occasionally I see people do walking past mine, it immediately tells you something. That person has never owned one, never driven one, and certainly never worked on one.